Welcome everybody to SAP Controlling conference in San Diego. We've got a special treat for the first hour. We're projecting an SAP Press book club meeting about my book that I wrote with Janet, who's joined us streaming in from Germany today. Thanks so much for co-authoring the book with me, Janet, and welcome everybody. I'd like to introduce my editor, Emily, for the last many years. For quite a few books. Thanks, Emily. I'll hand over to you to introduce the SAP Press Book Club.
Yes, so good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening for folks who are joining us over Zoom. I'm excited to kick off the first hybrid SAP Press Book Club meeting, so bear with us if we have some technical wrinkles here. But my name is Emily Nicholls, and I'm the Publishing Director at SAP Press. So in this capacity, I'm responsible for our SAP portfolio. So if you have feedback about books that we have published or ideas about books that we should publish, I'm the person. Come to me. For folks who are here in the San Diego Conference Center, I'll be over by the coffee, strategically placed. And for folks who are joining us over Zoom, please shoot me an email. We welcome feedback about our products, and we're proud of the quality that they offer to our readers. So I would like to introduce our panelists today, both in person beside me and online over Zoom. John Jordan here is known to all of the folks in the room here and around the world. He is the founder and principal consultant of ERP Corp, which provides expert SAP controlling consulting, and is hosting the conference that we are attending today here in person. John has written 8 books with SAP Press in the last 20 years, and I have been honored to work with him on some of those. He's currently working on his 9th, so someone should ask him about that next. Next, we have Janet Salmon, who's the Chief Product Owner for Management Accounting at SAP. She's accompanied many developments to its controlling components over the years as both a product and solution manager. In her current role, she helps design and implement innovative controlling solutions with SAP's development teams in Germany and in China. She regularly works with customers and user groups in the United States and Germany to understand their controlling challenges and requirements, and then bring those conversations to bear on her own SAP Press books. She has delivered thousands of pages directed at business users and business process owners, giving them detailed click-by-click instructions on how to run controlling with SAP systems. So together, John and Janet co-authored a new book this year, Production Variance Analysis in SAP S/4HANA. So over the course of today's book club, I'll give John and Janet plenty of room to discuss their book and share their expertise on this topic. We'll walk through the structure of the book from initial planning and cost estimates through actual costs, period, and processing and reporting. We'll then look at the future direction of production variance topics, exploring event-based production orders and universal parallel accounting. So I invite you to participate if you have questions along the way. There is a floating mic. I think Sheila is helping us with this. And for folks who are joining us over Zoom, please use the chat function, and my team will get those questions to me so that I may ask John and Janet here, and they can share their expertise with you. So we'll leave some time at the end for clarifications and final remarks. So I hope this works out. John, I will start with you. In a nutshell, can you tell me, why do we do production variance analysis? What benefit does this offer?
Oh, I'm glad you asked me that, Emily. Thanks for the introduction. I'm so glad to meet you in person after quite a few years. And we've got quite a few other SAP authors. I'm seeing some right up the front here. Paul, Tom, Rogerio. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone streaming from around the world. So what is production variance analysis? That's a very good question. It's really about product costing, which I believe is the most interesting module in SAP because it's integrated with everything else in SAP. So so we're talking about planning the cost to manufacture a product. And then you compare the actual cost with the planned cost. And that difference is the variance. So the question really is, why was the cost to actually manufacture something different from the plan cost. And remembering the plan cost is the cost estimate. Everybody knows how to create a cost estimate. You press the button, right? But there's a lot of work behind that. And the book is all about the work behind that. And each of the six first chapters list out the stages of product costing exactly the way that you need to know it. And the first chapter is initial planning. What's initial planning? It's really the sales planning that you do 12 months before you start the manufacture or you start the cost estimates. We need the sales quantity for the next 12 months to understand what the actual manufacturing quantities will be, and that allows us to plan how much those activities will cost to manufacture that 1,000 items or 1,000,000 items. The more you produce, obviously, the cost reduces. And we can plan that in the cost estimate, and we have the actual costs come through when we run the production orders and do the confirmations and the goods issues to the production orders. And Janet, please join me if you've got any comments in any of this. But that's the first chapter of the book. Janet wrote the 7th chapter of the book, which is the future direction of SAP product costing, and that's really the very interesting one. Where's SAP going? And Janet's going to share that with us when she discusses the 7th chapter. So what's the 2nd chapter?
Actually, John, I'm going to jump in before we get into the 2nd chapter. Then I want to go back to the initial planning question.
Please.
One of the projects of the book was to help folks understand the move from SAP ERP to SAP S/4HANA.
Yes.
So can you give me a sense of how much has changed for initial planning or further downstream in that shift from ERP to S4? Is there a noticeable difference, or are there minor tweaks that improve your life?
Okay. So the question is, if you're on ECC or R3, should you buy the book? And absolutely, because product costing, the concepts of product costing is the same in ECC as in S4. In S4, you've got the universal journal, and you've got the advantages of the operation and the work center in the universal journal, so you get extra reporting out of S4, but the basic concept of product costing stays the same. So it's useful for S4 and before S4.
So Janet, can you jump in here and give us a high-level summary of what changes the Universal Journal brought to production variance analysis as we move into S4? So what technical structural change happened?
I mean, I think most people have heard, meanwhile, that the Universal Journal combines your primary costs, so things like your material usage, any purchased goods that you've been buying specifically for a production order, and your secondary costs, so what we used to keep in separate CO tables, and puts them all into one place, this Universal Journal. At the moment, if you go to S/4HANA, though, the production variances, the table structure doesn't change at all. We're still looking at the information in the standard cost estimate. We're comparing it with what happens in the actuals, and then we're giving you the variance calculation. It's only when you get to chapter 7, to my chapter, where I start to talk about how universal parallel accounting throws all the givens on their head, how we really start to change the table structures there as well, and make all those period close processes part of what's ongoing, and generating journal entries for work in process and for variances as we go along. The other thing that I think people worry about as they get into that early planning stage is whether they're going to plan the old way using the classic planning transactions, or whether they're going to look at SAP Analytics Cloud for planning, which is something, obviously there's a tool element to that. There's a business content element to that, where we have the integrated business planning, which will support you in things like cost center planning, order planning, profitability planning, and so on. But you still need that nitty-gritty cost estimate stuff, because the master data that John's going to talk about in the following chapters, so things like your bill of material, your routing, the information in the work center, we don't attempt to move that into SAP Analytics Cloud for planning. We would do a cost estimate and then simply pull the results in, and then you can start doing various simulations. So, trying to decide what would be the impact of the change of a raw material cost. But yeah, so a lot of givens and some technical changes.
So John, moving into the cost estimate chapter, this is the second chapter of the book. Talk us through what's here.
Okay, and Janet mentioned a couple of key things there. The one thing is the master data, the bombs, the routings, the work centers, the material masters. There's 12 months of work setting all that up before you press the button to create the cost estimates, right? We all know that. Otherwise you get a lot of errors, which takes another month to work through those errors. There's a lot of work in actually creating the master data before you press the button. And the book explains all of the work in setting up the master data, the material masters, the bombs, the routings, together with the quantities from the sales quantities. We'll get the activity quantities. You multiply the activity quantities times the price information, the price of the activities, the price and the material masters gives you the cost to manufacture the finished good. So Janet mentioned the key term there, the master data, and of course the universal allows us to put extra information into the universal journal, which is the work standard and the operation, and all the data that you need is in the universal journal. Is the key, one of the key differences.
So are there any features of S/4HANA that you think that most controllers are underutilizing here?
In product costing,
In when creating cost estimates?
yes, the process is very similar, and SAP is continuing to introduce new functionality, especially with universal parallel accounting, so you can create a cost estimate for different valuations. And this is being worked on now, but it's very powerful.
Okay. Shifting into actual costs, which are sequentially coming after the cost estimates, what happens during this phase and what tends to trip up most controllers here?
Okay, so when you've created the cost estimate, which is the planned costs, the actual costs come generally with the production orders. You create a production order which copies all of the master data that we created for the cost estimates. We create it into production order, which then creates the preliminary cost estimate for the production order. And then as we confirm the activities, we issue the goods to the production order. We're introducing the actual costs, and in the background, SAP is comparing the actual costs with the planned costs that we have in the preliminary cost estimate. And of course, when we release the standard cost, that gives us the cost for when we do the goods receipt into the inventory of the finished product. And that standard cost we compare with the actual costs. There's a couple of cost estimates involved here. So you've got to realize there's the different cost estimates. And the book explains that very nicely.
One question that I get a lot is about actual costing in the material ledger. So Janet, can you give us some information on the key change in S/4HANA related to actual costing and the material ledger? What is mandatory here?
I mean, first things first, material ledger is mandatory in the sense that your material valuation will always be in multiple currencies now, but actual costing is very much still optional. One thing to determine there is, are you the sort of customer that actually needs actual costing? So there's industries where it's very common. So the food industry, the chemical industry, anywhere where you've got volatile material prices or volatile processes, actual costing makes a lot of sense. And then there's countries here like Brazil and Turkey where it's pretty much de rigueur to always use actual costing because you have a legal requirement to drain all your costs through inventory, to assign everything into inventory. Whereas in Europe and the US, it's more a kind of business decision whether you want to go that way or not. One of the things I think it's important to take away for S/4HANA is, though, the fear of performance. If you think what an actual costing has to do, it looks through every single purchase order, every single goods receipt, every single invoice receipt, and then tries to assign all those differences throughout whatever's happened in production in the course of the period, which is some pretty heavy lifting from a technological point of view. And what we did in 1610, so 6-7 years ago now, is we completely re-architected actual costing. So any fears you might have about performance should now be going away. It is much, much faster than it used to be. And of course, it's very hard to give me figures without knowing your exact system constellation. But the kind of myths around actual costing, that it's cumbersome and so on, take some of that away. Of course, the usual challenges of a controller, good data in will give you good data out. They still apply. Actual costing can't improve your processes. It can merely show you what you're writing down and then give you the basis to act on that information.
And if I'm using actual costing, do I need to run variance analysis?
You should run variance analysis in addition. So they're actually two different things. So production variance analysis is all about looking at individual production orders, looking at, did you have scrap that were things behaving as you expected? Did you have to switch out a component? Did you use more or less of an individual component or an individual activity? Whereas what actual costing is doing is working at a more aggregated level. It's not going production order by production order. It's taking all the purchase price variances for a particular raw material, and then it's trying to look where that raw material was used in the period and passing on those follow-on costs to any of your semi-finished goods, any work in process, any finished goods, and finally to your cost of goods sold. So it's working at a different level of aggregation. So your actual costing will tell you as a whole, was your production plan successful? Whereas the variance analysis that John and I are talking about specifically in the book will tell you were you successful for an individual production order. How did your real scrap relate to your planned scrap, for example?
Okay, so after actual cost, then we'll get into the chapters on period end processing.
Absolutely.
And you cover most of the variance here in this chapter and have a separate chapter on scrap variance. So kind of explain to me how these concepts work together.
Absolutely. Welcome we've got people entering the room still. Welcome everybody. We've got a full house here. This special edition of the SAP Press Book Club. So the period end processing, there's multiple processes. I picked one to write the book about, which I thought was the most interesting, variance analysis. There's other processes. And in ECC, it was obviously period end processing. And in S4, it's still period end processing. But SAP is obviously working on event-based as well. But at the moment, focus on period end processing. Fully understand that to start with. It's not mandatory yet to do event-based processing. Down the road, it may be. So variance analysis is not only the final step in period end. The final step is settlement in ECC and S4 at the moment. And that's when you go to real-time processing and event-based processing, these will all they'll happen real time. I included an extra chapter in the book on scrap processing because there's so much extra functionality in scrap. It's not only a parallel processing with the rest of the variance analysis, and SAP is working on developing the scrap analysis with S4. They're not there yet, but they are working on it. So that's an interesting chapter that explains every detail of scrap processing that should be interested on the production line. Planning the scrap. The thing with scrap is you can plan it and you can record actual scrap. That's why it's got its own chapter.
Mm-hmm. So the last series of chapters before we get to Janet is focused on reporting.
Yes.
So in terms of the finance department's reporting requirements, what trends are you seeing in recent years? Are those requirements changing related to how they report on production variance?
I don't think the requirements of production reporting are changing. The functionality in SAP is evolving to assist that analysis. So production planners need to know how much to plan, how many materials to get into inventory, then issue to the production orders, and then assemble them on the production lines. That won't change, but SAP is working on improving that with S4. And that's explained. The reporting has got its own chapter that's chapter 6 in the book. We have a lot of functionality with drill down reporting and reporting, real-time reporting. And the book covers the reporting available in ECC and the new reporting available with the Universal Journal in S4. And with Janet's help, we've written about the future direction of SAP and reporting using the Universal Journal.
So speaking of reporting, Janet, can you talk us through the difference between classic transaction codes and the SAP Fiori apps? What can you do with Fiori apps that maybe you couldn't have done with transaction codes?
So maybe the key thing to say is, as we move to S4, we tried to make sure that nothing was lost. So we had this idea of compatibility views, and the idea with a compatibility view is it just brings the data out of the Universal Journal and puts it back into the structure that we had before S4. So John talked about the work center and the operation being updated now. So if you were to look at the tables for any confirmation you've done, any materials you'd issued, you'd see the work center there, you'd see where it happened, and you'd see which operation it was. But if you use the classic reports, or even just the reports that you can see from within the production order, you won't see that. All you'll see is the old information. So you'll see that the work center is basically lost. You'll just see the production cost center and the production activities, because we didn't change that. We use these compatibility views to keep things smooth, to make sure that people aren't suddenly shocked and lost on day one of moving to S4. But of course, the danger is then you don't even realize that this new functionality. You just use what you've been used to and everything feels great. And so particularly in product costing, I think it's actually worth looking at the Fiori apps. It's worth looking at the apps that show you the costs by work center. Because if I could sort of zoom myself back 10 years to one of the most common questions that I would be asked, it's like, at the time that you capture this information, at the time that you record your scrap, at the time you make your confirmation, you tell the system which work center you were at and which operation you were on. But where is it in CO? You lose it. And we did just literally lose it. We wouldn't update it. We would aggregate it. And now the Universal Journal, if you were to compare, has many more lines in it because it includes the work center and it includes the operation. But in order to see that information, you're going to have to use the Fiori apps. And what we do in the book, we talk about all the standard Fiori apps. So this isn't a book that tells you how to build Fiori apps, build your own CDS views and so on, but it will walk you through the Fiori apps that are there and the sort of typical things that people stumble over the first time they use a Fiori app. Because there's just really simple differences. Like in a classic SAP report, you fill out a great selection screen and nothing happens until you press execute. And in the Fiori, you typically have the selection screen, the results on the same screen. And so you have your navigation is slightly different. And of course, once you've done it for a couple of apps, by the end of the first week, you're going to be totally happy with it. But that first time you use a Fiori app, it's a little bit of a shift.
So you've talked about the analyzed cost by work center and operation app. Can you tell me a little bit more about the product cost analysis app? What does this offer, and how does this work?
I mean, the production cost analysis app is actually pretty similar to the old order selection. So the old order selection would say, find me all the production orders in a particular plant, find me all the production orders for a particular product group, and so on. And it would give you then a list of production orders. And from there, you could then navigate to various reports that you'd show you your plan versus actual costs, or your target versus actual costs, or your variance categories, or your work in process. And the production variance app is actually very similar to that. It includes maybe a few more selection criteria. So things that you didn't have in the old tables, you can select by profit center, for example, but you can still do the old things like, show me everything in a plant, show me everything in a product group, show me everything that's got the status closed or whatever. And we tried to keep them fairly similar just to avoid people getting lost in there. It was impossible to keep them totally similar, though, simply because the data structures underneath are a little bit different.
So I think this moves us nicely into the direction that SAP is taking with some of the core finance functionality, particularly around production variance. The last chapter of the book looks at the future direction and what's happening under the hood to make this run smoother for folks who are using SAP S/4HANA. So Janet, I want to look at two things in particular. One is event-based processing, and the second is universal parallel accounting. So what is event-based processing, and how does this compare to the current norm or period-based processing?
Okay, so the event-based processing, essentially it means as a controller, you actually have to do nothing at all. Whereas previously you had to go in, you had to run overhead calculation, you had to go in and you had to run work in process calculation, and you had to run variance calculation, and then you had to run settlement to move everything into profitability analysis at period close. And what the event-based process does is it triggers everything as you go along. So if you do a raw material posting, it says, oh, you wanted to apply a 10% overhead, I'll put that overhead on top. You've just done a confirmation, or you wanted a 5% production overhead, I'll put that on top. And it would essentially give you two documents. The first would be your material document, and the second would be the 10% overhead or whatever it was. And the same with the confirmation, you'd have your activity confirmation and then the overhead on top. And then the event-based processing goes a step further and says, instead of waiting for period close and saying, how far have you got? I'm a quarter of the way finished, so I'm going to realize work in process for the quarter of the work I've done. It actually kicks off a work in process posting immediately. And the configuration around it's going to feel fairly similar. You've still got costing sheets, you've still got results analysis keys telling the system what to do here. But the posting logic's completely changed. So instead of calculating things and then using settlement to move them somewhere, there isn't a separate settlement process. Every time you release materials or every time you do a confirmation, you're going to see work in process being calculated immediately. And in terms of variance calculation, every time you get to the end of the order, every time it's complete, we're going to calculate and post the variances immediately. And of course, if the order never completes for some reason, we'll do it at the time of the technical close. And of course, this changes the way a controller is going to work. In the past, there was somebody in the period close making sure that these things got done and making sure that the figures were correct. Now they're running successfully in the background, but we've got monitoring apps that allow you to make sure that everything's gone through as you expect. If there is a problem, if the configuration is broken or something, you know that the worst thing you could do is stop a production line as a controller, so the material movements and so on will go through, but we'll park all those documents and say we weren't able to calculate variances or we weren't able to calculate overhead. So the controller's job switches to being more of a monitoring and making sure that the config was okay. And if somebody does a manual journal entry, for example, against a production order, those things aren't picked up in event-based variance calculation or WIP calculation, but we allow you to generate those journal entries after the fact as a simulated post-transaction there. So your daily work would actually change quite a lot by moving to event-based. And I mean, I really quite like the idea. One of my early customers was an ice cream manufacturer, and their production was always in the fridge at the end of the day. But I would then have to explain to them why it was a good idea to wait to the end of the period to actually look whether they'd been good. And this way, you know, if all your ice cream is the fridge at the end of the day, you've got your variance analysis complete at the end of the day. You can say, was that a good day? Did your yield do what you expected, or was there something untoward that you want to look into?
So the ice cream example is interesting. Are there specific industries that might find this functionality most attractive to use?
I mean, I think it's actually possibly the other way around, because universal parallel accounting isn't far enough on in some areas. The make-to-stock manufacturers are going to be fine already. So anybody working in the public cloud, our default is now event-based with universal parallel accounting. So, you know, if you're making widgets, there's nothing very special about it. You know, things will be fine with the new approach. Where we've still got quite a lot of work to do is make to order and particularly engineer to order, where you've got a slightly more complex situation in that you've got revenues being realized as you go along, and a shift from results analysis into event-based revenue recognition. And we're not complete there.
So that's my next question, is how far have we come already with event-based processing? Is this functionality still relatively young and you're expecting the next few releases to be offering a big jump forward, or is this already mature?
It depends who you are. So it's obviously, when I talk to a public cloud customer, they're typically smaller, they're typically running things in one plant, they haven't been doing something for the last 20 years that they want to keep doing. Whereas if I talk to an on-premise or even a private cloud customer, if they've been doing, for example, mixed costing for the last 20 years, I don't win a lot of flowers if I say, I'm sorry, we don't do mixed costing anymore. So particularly, it was interesting writing the book with John, while at the same time trying to write the specifications so we could do mixed price variances in hopefully the next or the one after edition of S/4HANA, and also the scrap variances. Because as we said, from a business point of view, nothing really changes. Scrap is still scrap, and how you account for scrap in your master data, there's no change there. Everything that John wrote is still valid. But the difference is our data structures have changed, and we have to start recording what the scrap would be in the cost estimate for the production order in order to be able to evaluate it later. And the same with the mixed price variances. You know, the need to have multiple sources to buy a component or to buy a semi-finished product, that doesn't change. That's always been there. But what we are saying is we haven't yet enabled that in universal parallel accounting, and we will be going on to do that. So, I mean, my gut feeling, and don't quote me, is probably, you know, the next 2 or 3 years, there'll be a constant flow of things being finished, hopefully sooner rather than later, because that's my job, to get it out sooner rather than later.
If only we wouldn't distract you with book club and new books to write. So let's look more broadly at the universal parallel accounting. I know this has ramifications beyond just production variance analysis. What is this, and what's the connection?
So universal parallel accounting, if we leave out product costing at all, came out of a co-innovation with a number of large German customers. And the idea was that it was accounting for international business. And there's really sort of 4 elements to this. The first element is, if you're in an international business, you almost always have multiple accounting principles. And now you're probably going to say, well, yeah, of course, I've got French GAAP, German GAAP, Belgian GAAP, whatever. But the point is that you've probably got French GAAP, German GAAP, Belgian GAAP in your local subsidiaries. But if you're headquartered in the US, you'd actually probably like to do US GAAP for everybody as well. So the idea that you would have 2 completely separate sets of standard costs, the one being the standard cost according to US GAAP, and the second being the standard cost according to French GAAP, German GAAP, whatever it is. Then the next element of that, and I think this is really confusing for people who've been in the product costing world for too long, myself included here. So that element of product costing, the idea of having different standard costs for each ledger, we never had before. And I would even argue previously, I didn't think we needed it because I felt it was going to confuse all the plant controllers. But now in theory, you're going to have to make a call and say, am I going to judge my plant manager in Switzerland based on US GAAP or based on Swiss GAAP? What we, the product costing people, have always called parallel accounting, though, has been really what we call parallel valuations. So things like group valuation, where you try to just take the true costs of doing business across an international supply chain. So instead of looking at the transfer prices, the agreements that you've got between the various subsidiaries about who's selling what to who, you simply say, these were the true costs of the parts that I made in Switzerland and the parts that I made in Germany and the parts that I made in France. And I brought them all into the US, and then I turned them into a finished good, which I'm selling to a US customer. And what we've done there is we've changed the architecture. So instead of those being in what we used to call multi-valuation ledgers, where you had a separate column for your group valuation or your profit center valuation, those move out into a ledger of their own. They're completely separate. It means you can much more easily segregate what's happening in that group view. And we've also changed the processing behind that. So intercompany sales processes, intercompany stock transfer processes, we've been re-architecting those as well. And this isn't just a finance topic, it's something that's been going on in logistics, to really manage the way that a front office would capture the order with the external customer and then convey the information back as a copy of the sales order saying, dear US subsidiary, please will you manufacture something for me? Or dear US subsidiary, please will you deliver these goods for me? And you're getting into a much easier situation for afterwards to say, who were the trading partners in this process? What were the contractual agreements between the delivering company and the selling company? And then as the goods actually get on the boats and go to wherever they go, or get on the planes, go to whatever they go, you're managing that as stock in transit, which again isn't a new concept, but it becomes a standard concept within universal parallel accounting. And the final piece is the currency piece. Historically, CO only had 2 currencies, and everybody else had always felt like had 3, except the general ledger, which had 10 currencies. And so what would happen there is if you did an allocation, it would work in the first 2 currencies, you did your company code currency and your group currency. And then if you had something like a functional currency or an index currency or anything else in there, the system would just hop along and create and convert the results, which actually caused quite a lot of inaccuracies. It's been one of my questions of the last 15 years. I've lost count of the number of mails I've written saying, no, I'm sorry, this is how it works, but it's not good the way it works. And we've changed that with universal parallel accounting. So those are completely independent, really, of product costing. And what changes for product costing is some very critical choices. So as you think your way back through John's chapter, your planning process, for example, your activity rates, you have to make a choice whether you say, I'm going to have a different activity rate in Switzerland from the one that I'm going to have in the US, because the way I write off my assets in Switzerland is actually different from the way I would write off my assets in the US. And this is one of those materiality calls. We can technically say, yeah, you can have two ledgers with different prices in it. But the really interesting question is, how different are those activity rates? And does it make sense to carry two completely separate activity rates? The same as you come into your stock valuation. You can choose in the costing type whether you say, I'm doing a cost estimate and it's the same for Swiss GAAP as it is for US GAAP, of the fact that it's in dollars or in Swiss francs. Or whether you say, no, the differences are material enough that I want to do a cost estimate for Swiss GAAP versus a cost estimate for US GAAP and update those in parallel. So when you come to things like marking and releasing, you're suddenly going to find these strange things like the ledger appearing to say, would you like which ledger would you like to update and which cost estimate have you got behind it? So again, it becomes a controlling question. Are you going to carry on before and have standard costs the same according to each accounting principle? Or are you going to split them and have different sets of standard costs depending on your accounting principle? And there are two schools of thought. There are German customers who adore this idea, and there are German customers that just look at me horrified and say, Jan, this is just way too much of a good thing. This is just going to confuse people. Please, 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 can we have the same values in each ledger? And I think every customer's got to make their own call there about how different these things are.
And one question from folks on Zoom is, does universal parallel accounting make parallel cost of goods manufactured obsolete?
Good question. So effectively it does. It's just think of it as the next generation of parallel cost of goods manufactured. So parallel cost of goods manufactured was something that I actually wrote the specification for back in Enhancement Package 5, which seems like a very long time ago now. And really what we did then was we made a lot of compromises. You were still keeping things in separate versions. You were keeping things in separate depreciation areas. And we were trying to not be too radical in the architecture. And now we've been very radical. You'll find if you go into asset accounting that half the IMG has disappeared and everything is handled by the ledger. There's no depreciation area. It's really just a set of settings that tell you how you're going to depreciate. The same as you move into controlling, you've got universal allocation handling the ledgers cleanly. You've got your product costing giving the option to handle things cleanly. But yeah, just think of it as the next generation of parallel cost of goods manufactured. So the fact is at the moment we're working on conversion tools so you can pull the information that you had in parallel cost of goods manufactured into the new table structure.
So similar question on the kind of the life cycle of universal parallel accounting. Where are we in terms of the development, and what excites you about what's ahead?
Where are we? We're very definitely in the middle at the moment. We've got customers working on it. Don't let anybody tell you that there's nobody working on it. The way it works in on-premise at the moment is because we're not mature, anybody who wants to use universal parallel accounting opens up a message and Nicoletta and I get on a call with them and we walk through the functions. And then the customer either says, okay, yeah, I'm fine with that. Or, we agree to wait. What a number of customers are also doing is they're using the business function just on a test box to try and understand it more with no intention of going productive in the next year or two, but they just want to understand it. In terms of where we stand and maybe what's coming, so 2023, it's pretty safe to say what's out there. Profit center valuation within universal parallel accounting will be out there, and the first conversion tools. But the first conversion tools won't yet migrate you if you've got group valuation or profit center valuation running. And then we'll have to do all the kind of UGL migration tools that said, if I want to add a ledger, if I want to add a currency, if I want to add a this or that or the other. So there's obviously a lot of work there. And the other thing I've got to be careful of with conversion tools is I've got the table structure underneath, but it's important that I can update it from above, which is where things like I don't yet support results analysis. I can only do event-based revenue recognition come into play, where I'm working with customers to sort of say, results analysis is obviously enormous. What are the 10 things you do today? So we can do those 10 things first and then move up onto the next 10 things. So the question of when will you be finished is really quite scary. And of course, the trouble is, just as you think you might be finished, you realize also that the business world is changing, that, I now talk to engineer to order customers who don't just deliver their finished elevator or whatever to the customer, but they run all sorts of service contracts on top of that. There's a much more complex process than just building it, shipping it. There's the whole business of how do you manage the revenue flow over time? How do you manage the service? And all that, of course, has got to be taken account of as well. It's not just we've decided to have a new architecture and wouldn't that be nice? But reality moves on. The world gets more complicated. People's business models change. And of course, our software has to reflect that. So obviously we co-innovate with customers who tell us all about these things. But it does make things kind of scary, because I find myself working with customers that I worked with 20 years ago, and I think I know their processes, only to discover that the world has moved on. And maybe you don't buy a huge packaging machine the way you used to do. You lease that huge packaging machine and you pay per package or whatever. It's a completely different way of dealing with it. It's no longer a capital invest the way it was when I was consulting for them. It becomes an operational expense. And all of that, of course, has to find its way into universal parallel accounting, because we're saying this is the future architecture, but there's no good doing a future architecture for the process that was good 20 years ago, but has now moved on.
So, John, as you were working with Janet on this book, did you have any aha moments as you were kind of thinking of this shift from ERP to S4? Business models are changing. The underlying technical structure of S4 has changed. What went through your head as you were preparing this content for today's production variance analysis?
One of the main things that Janet's mentioned, I mentioned, and I'll mention again, is that to access the extra information in the Universal Journal, you have to use the Fiori apps. You can still use the GUI apps, GUI reports and transactions, and they're great. You just don't get to access the Universal Journal with them. And that became clear during the writing of the book that that's the key advantage of the Fiori apps. It also became clear in the reporting, especially SAP is still working on this. They're still working on the scrap analysis, and the Universal Journal obviously is in development. So it's exciting seeing where SAP is going and improving the period end processing with the event-based processing and the real-time reporting that comes with that. I just want to mention to all the consultants and the end users out there in the world that are currently using period-based processing, that's still very relevant at the moment and still will be for quite a while. You can glance at event-based processing and start to read up on it. There's blogs appearing out there. It's very interesting. You don't have to be an expert in it yet. That's a few years down the track, but keep track of the developments and the blogs and that Janet and myself and many other SAP authors in the audience here are writing very often about what they learn about the latest developments in SAP. The Fiori apps are relevant if you want to see the additional information in the Universal Journal, and that's the work center in operation and variance analysis.
So for folks who are here in San Diego, are there presentations today that you would recommend as kind of the follow-up to this session?
There's many excellent presentations coming up. Paul Vigel is going to follow up with his keynote today and keynote tomorrow on many of the recent functionality available. I think, Paul, can you remind me what the keynote today is?
Predictive accounting.
Predictive accounting. And tomorrow?
Universal allocation.
Universal allocations. and many other sessions today and tomorrow that I'm looking forward to seeing myself, and they're all very relevant.
So what would you recommend for folks who are business users or consultants? Where should they be going for more information? You have another book coming up.
I do. I started the first chapter yesterday, in the spare time at the conference. The next book is the full edition of this book. I wrote this book as the first book because it's a smaller topic. For me to get my mind around when I'm writing it, it's a 300-page book. The next book has all the details of product costing in it, and it's a 700-page book, and it's a reference book if you need to discover some detail that might not be in this book. This book gives you the flow of the information to understand the process. The next book I'm writing at the moment with Janet has all the details, and it's a different book, but they're both very relevant books, and it will be coming out, I think, early next year.
That's the plan. If the authors just get to writing, then we'll but can you kind of explain to me, you have said before that product costing is a journey and production variance is only the one piece of it. So what is the relationship between these ideas? It's not just that this fits into the bigger book and offers 300 of the 700 pages. The product costing book goes far beyond this. What's its scope? Right.
So this gives the journey in 300 pages. You can read this cover to cover in a couple of days, in a week. And I recommend anybody who's beginning or knows product costing as a refresher to give you the flow of the information. The trouble with product costing, to understand it, if you go into one of the sections of product costing, for instance, like the production order, and try to understand how that relates to cost estimates, you need to understand how all those pieces flow together, and this book gives that flow. Now, if you get into one of those detailed areas and you need to know a lot more detail, the next book that's coming out has all that detail in it. At the moment, I'm writing about costing sheets in the new book, and there's a lot of detail in there, percentage-based, quantity-based, all these details that are relevant when you're getting into the detail of costing sheets that may not be covered in this book. So both books are a valuable reference in your journey through product costing.
Well, I want to leave some time for audience questions, and I've received some from the folks over Zoom. Janet, could you clarify quickly, how again do you trigger event-based processing? Is this automatic in S4 Cloud only?
No. So event-based processing is always linked to the universal parallel accounting business functions. So you can actually switch the costing sheets to work event-based today if you're on S4HANA, but the work in process calculation and the variance calculation are linked to the universal parallel accounting business function. And then the configuration of it is around the results analysis key. So we've got a results analysis key that tells the system how you're going to do your work in process calculation, which variances categories would you like, and also if you're not just settling to material, what other settlement receivers would you like to allow? Should it be cost centers, orders, profit projects, and so on? And essentially the trigger, because you have no period end closing, is it happens as the accounting documents are created. So when you create a material document or when you create a confirmation document, the system's going to look at the results analysis key and it's going to say, okay, and it's going to look at the costing sheet and it's going to say, I need to add on a material overhead and I need to create work in process. And as you get to the goods receipt, it's going to say, I need to reverse out that work in process and I need to calculate variances now. So the configuration options that John talks about actually stay relevant. It feels unnatural to have a results analysis key still and a costing sheet still, but the configuration, the logic of what percentage of overhead would you like to apply stays the same. But the difference is it's the hitting the accounting document, the accounting interface that triggers these additional things. And if you work with event-based revenue recognition, it's the same basic idea. Every time you hit the accounting interface, the system looks and says, are you relevant for revenue recognition? Have you got a results analysis key? And then uses that configuration to say, what should I be posting now? You know, are you doing percentage of completion? Are you doing completed contract or whatever?
I also want to run a microphone. It's me. I'm going to run the microphone. If you could speak up, actually, that would be great. Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Got a microphone runner, volunteer, Emily. Thank you. What's your name?
Raj.
Raj, thank you.
So, John, it's good to know that the variance reporting has improved a little bit in S4 with additional information such as work center and operations. Along the same lines, even today in S4, Janet, there is no product costing report which lets you list all your materials that you have costed with cost components against them. It is always like one material at a time. Why is a report like that still not available in S4? Is there any underlying technical reason for that?
We just built one for the actual costing run, but it's based on the on actual costing. So there's an app called, I think it's called Display Costing Results or Display Actual Costing Results.
What if you're not looking at costing? What if you want to run a standard cost report of that nature?
I mean, the standard costing reports, the standard costing structure hasn't changed at all. So you can use the old ABAP list view reports that say show your whole costing run. But I think what you're getting to is a list of materials, and then you'd like to see the aggregated production orders against that list of materials.
And
yeah.
cost components details against them. There's no standard report per se available.
But you don't have cost components on the production orders. You've either got them in the standard costs or you've got them after you've done actual costing.
Product cost reports, not
I think Raj, I might have written a blog on that previously. Let's talk after this, and I'll point you in that right direction.
I just had one last question.
Yes.
Those companies, Janet, that are right in the middle of an SAP implementation of S4, and we have new product offerings coming in from SAP. Are these scalable in future for us to activate them later, or will we be missing that window? Will we have to dismantle a lot of what we are doing right now to accommodate those new functionalities later?
I mean, the first thing is, at the moment, you know, universal parallel accounting is greenfield, and you've got no data at all in your system. So it's very much if you're right at the beginning, you can do it. We're going to be offering the first migration tools in this autumn. For most people, they won't be mature enough. So the idea is, of course, we've got to try and take all our customers with us. So the idea is that at some point, the maturity of universal parallel accounting is sufficient and the conversion tools are sufficient that we can then take the people that have been running S4 for the last 4 or 5 years and move them into this new environment.
Thanks, Janet.
Thanks, Raj. Any other questions? Go ahead, please step up to the mic. What's your name?
My name is Michelle. I'm currently going to be starting the greenfield implementation into S/4HANA. We started in 2019, and then because of COVID, we had to pause. So we're starting up again. And my company is kind of divided between parallel valuation and parallel currency. So we're currently running 2 different controlling areas. So I'm looking to, when I saw information initially on the parallel universal accounting, I was really excited about it because it looked like it'll be able to pull those 2 together. But then I found out it doesn't work potentially with repetitive manufacturing. So I'm kind of want to get some understanding around that.
I mean, that's also something that's in planning at the moment. I think it's due out 2023, but I should probably check for you and get that information to John. Certainly the colleagues have been working on it. So yeah, the product cost collectors we didn't support initially. It was only production orders and process orders. But I'm pretty sure we do have product cost collectors in 2023, but let me just check that they got through the quality control okay, and that they'll be out for you.
Another question. What's your name, Dawn?
Hi, I'm Dawn Watts. Hi, Janet. It's a pleasure to hear from you. So the question I have is in regards to material ledger actual costing, which you briefly mentioned in the book. But in regards to that, the alternative valuation run can now be run more on a quarterly basis or not every month. So with that being the case from 1610 version 1610 on, what about the postings associated with that? So with an alternative valuation run, you don't have that option of, necessarily revaluing your inventory. So how would you go about revaluing your inventory in that scenario where you're running an alternative valuation run on a quarterly basis or maybe an annual basis, just as an?
It's a good question, yeah, and I now I think about it, I don't think we really went into it properly in the book. So the way the alternative valuation run always used to work was you did a period-based calculation, and then you came along, for example, quarter by quarter, and said, okay, take January to March or April to June and accumulate and use that as your alternative valuation run. And we don't support the delta postings now. The delta logic is changed. So the idea is that instead that you would set up your costing run so it would be cumulative from the start. So it would, for example, take the whole year. I'm trying to think if there's any material that I can share with you about it, though. But you can still do an alternative valuation run, but the logic has changed. And John, I'll get you some information, and it's not completely not there, but the delta logic has changed because we always used to do a posting and then we did an adjustment posting.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Don.
I have a question from someone on Zoom. Will event-based consider standard cost at the time of running goods receipt?
I mean, that's actually a really good question, because event-based can only deal with the information that it has. So, of course, your standard costs become even more important because you're doing your variances against those standard costs at the time that you do the goods receipt. But of course, but is the background to that question the actual costing that you do an adjustment later?
Sorry, Janet, say that one more time.
I'm trying to think what the background of the question is. What are you kind of getting at behind that? Because obviously the challenge with event-based is you can only know what you know at the time of the event. And if your invoices are coming in later, or people are doing a posting overtime or whatever, then your activity rate's going to change. Maybe your energy consumption is actually priced differently initially. So you would still potentially have a need for actual costing to true things up at the period close.
I think we probably have time only for one or two more questions. This is coming from Zoom. What about doing variance analysis in a central finance scenario? Do you have to make sure all indirect costs are brought back correctly to the source, or can you do this analysis in central finance?
Oh, that's a very good question. So the actual variance calculation transactions, we're still suggesting you do those locally. What I'm having quite a lot of discussions with various customers at the moment, though, is how you bring those variances then up into central finance, particularly when you've got different accounting methodologies in your local systems. And I don't know if there's any of the consultants in the room who've got more experience of what individual customers have been doing there, but maybe people can share that.
We've got some sessions on central finance at the conference. We've got some experts who as well might give their point of view on that. We can remember to ask Anand that question. I'm sure I'll be happy to give this point of view.
Do we have any more questions in the audience before we wrap up here? Well, I want to thank everyone again for joining us on both Zoom and here in San Diego, and working with us as we figure out the quirks of doing a hybrid book club like this. But on behalf of SAP Press, I'm very grateful for the participation of our readers and the active questions, so that we know what to be asking authors and how to be expanding our list to meet the needs of the SAP Press reader community. So John and Janet, it's always a pleasure to work with you both. I'm grateful for your time and sharing your expertise today.